So there's this video that's going around, making its rounds on the internet, and you may have seen it. But for whatever reason, this guy got these two teenage boys and put them in front of a rotary telephone and said, "You have 4 minutes. And if in 4 minutes you can make a phone call with this phone, you'll get something. You'll get a reward." It's hilarious. If any of you have grown up using or at any time used a rotary phone, it's great. In this video, these boys start out, they don't even pick up the handset for like the first 2 minutes. They're trying to figure out how to dial, but they don't even know that none of it's working until you pick up the handset. You know, I remember when my dad got his first cell phone, one of those bag phones that's in the car. And it was the first time that after you dialed a number, you had to press send. You know, like it didn't do it automatically when you were done. Well, we're so used to that now because of cell phones that these kids have no idea you got to pick up the handset in order to start dialing. And it's great if you come across it. It's great to watch these, you know, these Generation Z, these young guys trying to figure out this old piece of technology. Well, we've studied in both my Sunday school class and I've studied at a conference this year about generations and about the different generations we've grown up in. I am, and I always like to make sure I mention, I'm at the tail end of Generation X, and I say that because I don't want you to call me a millennial. Which I joke about because we give millennials a hard time, but the reality is we all are weird in our generations. We all have our quirks and our struggles and the things that you see kind of good in our generations and the challenges that we see. And for any generation you don't like the way that you know they might come across, it's their parents' fault anyway. So it's it's my generation, it's your generation that may have caused that. But I was thinking about my generation. I'm in this weird kind of end of one generation, almost the beginning of another. And so the tail end of Generation X, I grew up in like both an analog and a digital world. You know, what I remember as a kid was having cassette tapes and using those to listen to music. And we'd put them in our radio and record songs off the radio that we wanted to hear. And if you wanted to hear it again, you had to rewind it. Remember those days? You couldn't just put it on repeat. And I remember VCRs as the main thing that we used to watch movies at home. And I remember even, you know, trying to figure out we'd go and we'd rent a movie, and I don't know if you remember this, but you'd get charged extra if you didn't rewind it when you took it back to the video store. These are not issues that my children will ever understand, right? And some of you have some, you know, previous to that technology that you remember that I don't understand and was never a part of. But I had that kind of analog world, but then I also, you know, by middle school, things were changing. When I was 14, we got our first computer, our first personal computer with Windows on it that went in our house, and it had a CD-ROM. I was the first one in my class to have a computer with a CD-ROM. And then shortly after, we had the internet. And I don't know if you remember the internet of those days, but the internet would dial up a phone number, and you'd hear all those noises, and then it would connect, and it was incredibly slow. And not only that, we lived in a small town, so that phone number was a long-distance call to get onto the internet. So I'll never forget the month that my parents came down screaming my brother's name because he had racked up $300 on the phone bill by being on the internet and the long-distance call. That was not a good day. I remember when social media happened, you know, this Facebook stuff, MySpace used to be a thing. And I remember when Facebook opened, my brother actually was in college and came and said, "Have you heard about Facebook? We connect with people, do all this kind of stuff." And I'm like, "Oh, that's cool." And so I went to check it out, but I was no longer in college. I didn't have a college email address. And at the time, you could only get on Facebook if you had a college-given email address. So you had to have an email address that ended in, like, your college's address. So I couldn't get on it. till about 6 months later when Facebook opened it up to everyone, and now all of us are on it, right? Most of us, not all of us. But we got on there, and I remember at the very beginning starting to kind of look and find my friends from high school, find old friends from college, connect with people I hadn't seen. And I remember the value of connecting with people that I hadn't seen in a while. And it was always interesting to see how they changed. It had been 10 years since we'd been in high school together. So some of us, we got older, obviously. Some got balder. Some got heavier, skinnier, got successful or not. And we'd look, you could look and you could see, but I also saw some that had transformed lives. It was crazy to catch up with somebody that I would have never guessed in high school would ever choose to follow Jesus, encounter him in college, and now be in ministry following him. I remember seeing those lives that had been transformed, and it's like, man, I wasn't a part of that story, but how cool to catch up with somebody. There are some benefits to that. Well, transformed relationships are important. And really, it's Jesus' go-to. Whenever we see Jesus encounter people, there's almost always some kind of transformation that happens in them. So I want to look at two moments where we see those transformed relationships and see how that can speak to us today. The first one I told the kids about. It's one of my favorite stories. Zacchaeus. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm short. But Luke chapter 19 says this. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and he was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and say, he is gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. So Jesus comes and he encounters Zacchaeus. And I just want you to catch this kind of pattern that happens. When Jesus encounters people, his first reaction is always acceptance. Zacchaeus was a tax collector, so he was an outcast in those people. I mean, it would be like Russia taking over the United States and your neighbor beginning to work for Russia and coming and collecting money from you to go to the enemy that has just taken us over. I mean, working for Rome, and then most of them actually took some off the top and were cheating people out of money as well. This is not a well-liked person. So Jesus comes upon Zacchaeus, and what's his first reaction? His first reaction, as most of us would kind of plan it out ourselves, would probably be, hey, Zacchaeus, let's talk about your lifestyle. Let's talk about what you're choosing to do with your life, because you need to make some changes. And if you make some changes, I'll come over. We can have a relationship. We can see things happen. But that's never Jesus' reaction. First thing he always does, he comes to Zacchaeus and he says, hey, Zacchaeus, why don't you come out of that tree? Because I'm going to come to your house. That signifies something, right? I'm coming to your house. And we know that matters because everybody else starts grumbling. How dare he go to Zacchaeus' house? This tax collector, this sinner. But Jesus always starts with acceptance. And then what happens? Doesn't take much time with Jesus before Zacchaeus finds transformation in his life. So out of that comes obedience. It starts with Jesus comes and doesn't tell him what to do, but instead just says, hey, Zacchaeus, let's go to your house. Let's have dinner together. Let's talk. But out of that relationship, Zacchaeus has changed, right? Doesn't take long, and he's like, hey, if anybody If I've cheated anybody, I'm going to give it back. I'm going to pay everybody back. I'm going to change up the way that I'm living and the way that I'm acting so that I can be what Jesus wants me to be. Starts with acceptance. It leads to obedience. The second one I want to look at is another familiar story. It's out of John chapter 8. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who'd been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" They said this to test him so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and he said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." Once again, we see this encounter. Of course, they're trying to catch Jesus. They know the law. And so they don't want to show, if he shows mercy, he's breaking the law. And that's going to trip him up. And if he doesn't, then now he's not the guy that's been talking about loving your enemies all this time. So what is Jesus to do? Well, he never seems to get caught in these traps. He instead bends down, writes in the ground. Of course, we speculate what he wrote. If he wrote the sins of the people that were standing there, who knows? But instead he said, "If you have no sin, throw the first stone." But what I like the most is what happens after that. Everybody leaves. And he turns to this woman and he says, "Where is everybody to condemn you?" And she says, "They've all left." And he said, "Well then," once again, he starts with acceptance. "Then neither do I condemn you." And after showing his acceptance towards her, then he says, "Go and sin no more." Obey. Do what's right as a response to this relationship. Now we see that, and we can see God's encounter with his people through Jesus. To come with love and lead towards obedience is the kind of transformational relationship that Jesus had with people on this earth. It's also the kind of transformational relationship that God has with us. He starts with loving us and accepting us, but that doesn't mean he wants us to stay where we're at. It means he wants to move us into obedience through that love. But also it gives us an image of how we should be treating one another, how we should be living in community. For several weeks we've been talking about community within the church. And what this does is it highlights for us what it looks like to live in community with one another. Proverbs 27:17 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so a friend sharpens a friend." We need relationships that push us, that teach us, that hold us accountable, but they have to start the way Jesus always started, with acceptance and with love. And through that, we move towards obedience to Christ. We've been talking the last 3 weeks about 3 people that we find in the book of Acts in the New Testament: Paul and Barnabas and Timothy. And really, they're just not only are they great men of the early church that God used in a powerful way, but they also are representative for us of relationships within our church body. We have Paul, the evangelist, the one who came to know Jesus on the road to Damascus, whose life was transformed by an encounter with Christ. And he went from persecuting the Christians to becoming one of the greatest evangelists for the church. He was a teacher, and then he went on to be a mentor to many. We talked about Barnabas, who, if you remember in that transformation when Paul came back to Jerusalem, nobody wanted him to be around. The church leaders didn't trust him until Barnabas spoke up for him, vouched for him. And again, Barnabas, whose real name was Joseph, was called the son of encouragement, somebody who encouraged, supported, and showed charity towards him. And then we have Timothy, we talked about last week. A younger man, grew up, became a believer through a Christian mother and grandmother, who Paul called out to go and serve in ministry, eventually finding himself in a position of leadership in the church of Ephesus, but a mentee of Paul's. Somebody Paul poured his life into as a son in the faith. He invested in him. We need to be doing that with one another. But the reality is sometimes we come with kind of our preconceived expectations and our prerequisites for friendship and relationship. You know, whether it's in church or elsewhere, we often have those kind of prerequisites where we expect, if you'll be this kind of person, then we can maybe be friends. If you'll do the things that I think you should do, maybe we can. If we have the same interests, if this, if that, if something, then maybe we can have some kind of relationship. I was like that as a kid. My brother and I would play with our toys a certain way, and sometimes we went to somebody's house, and if he played wrong, we'd take our toys and go home because you couldn't make the sound for the Transformers the way you were supposed to. But sometimes we grow up and we have that same kind of attitude towards each other. And in the church, you know, maybe it's, well, you go to the other service than me, and so that's just not worth my time. Or you know, we have a different way of thinking about what's happening in our world. So this is probably not going to be a relationship that we can hold. But what we see from Jesus in Zacchaeus, in the woman caught in adultery, in pretty much every relationship he has in the gospel, is Jesus doesn't start with a prerequisite. He says, you are loved. Let's you and me talk. And then through those relationships, he encouraged obedience. Now we have the opportunity to do the same kind of thing. To accept one another, to love one another first, and then to help each other move towards a greater obedience to God and his call for our lives. Because all of us need that. If you think you're there, you're wrong. Sorry. You need to be changed and transformed. While God accepts us as we are, he doesn't leave us there. He moves in us so we can be transformed. So in your bulletin, you have that little slip of paper. And we have this new ministry that the deacons and I have been working on and planning for the last couple months. And it's called microgroups. And it's called microgroups because one of the things that's really big in churches are small groups, right? You've heard of small groups. Small groups oftentimes are anywhere from 8 to 20 people that meet together on a consistent basis with the intention of growing together, living life together, all that kind of stuff, so that we can grow. Well, that's too big. It's not. We have those things in other areas through our Bible studies, Sunday schools, small groups, that kind of stuff. But micro groups are something different. And here's what it is. I talked to you about our generational differences at the beginning this morning. Some of us grew up in an analog world. Some of us were caught in the middle. And some today have grown up. My kids have grown up never not knowing what a touch screen is, you know? I remember my oldest son one time, my wife brought out the laptop and he was trying to touch the screen and move things before the laptop screens, which now you can do that. But at the time, the laptop screen didn't do that. Our phones did that. He didn't understand what this little mouse pad was, but he understood touching a screen. I never understood touching a screen until a few years ago when that happened. We have all these differences among our generations, among the lives that we've lived, but we are called into relationship with one another, to accept each other, to lead towards obedience. So we're starting this thing called microgroups. And here's what it is. We want to encourage you to get into a group of 3. This is why we've been talking about Paul, Barnabas, and Timothy. 3 different people. So we're talking about a group of 3 that are separated by our ages and our generations. So in that group, we need somebody who is a Timothy, the young person of the group. And they might be somebody that's a teenager. They might be somebody that's in their 20s. Somebody that is younger and of the younger generations. Because, let me tell you, if you're my generation or older, you need these people in your life. You need to hear from and learn from and experience life through the eyes of somebody that has grown up native to this crazy digital world we now live. You need that in your life. Not only that, they need you too. So we need that Timothy, that young person in this group. We need that Paul, that kind of in the middle, that mentor to the young, that somebody that fits in that middle age group, middle age kind of space. And then we're using Barnabas as our representation of somebody that would be older. So that out of 3 people, we have this span of 3 generations to begin to build a relationship. And here's what we're calling you to do. Like the Acts relationship of Barnabas and Paul and Timothy, we need those 3 people, those 3 groups of people to organize. Varying ages, same gender, so 3 men, 3 women getting together to meet together in whatever way works. So what we want to encourage you to do, if you're interested in building these kinds of relationships, is sign up, use that little card to let us know that you want to be involved. And you may know somebody that you would say, hey, I'd love to be in a group with this person, this young person, this person older than me, and somebody that I would love to be able to grow my relationship with. And then what we're going to do, for those of you that are willing to seek out this kind of relationship, is we're going to match you up into groups of 3. And then here in late February, we're going to gather together on a Sunday evening and kind of have a kickoff where we have a chance to kind of get to know each other for the first time. And then we're going to encourage you to go out and do this from there. Meet once a week, maybe once a month. Meet for coffee or have a Bible study or just get together or go to lunch or whatever it is that works in your group so that we can build relationships. The reality is, and I've said this several times these last couple weeks, it's hard to have community when we're separated. And we have multiple church services. We have multiple Bible studies, Sunday school classes. So many of them are separated by age into groups of people, your own age group, that we often don't have a chance to branch out of there into relationships with people of other ages. And the reality is, that's the best thing that a church does in this culture, is surround us with family of all different places in life so that we can be encouraging each other, learning from each other, and growing together. So this morning, I want to encourage you to take that slip of paper. If you're interested in doing it today, feel free to fill that out and leave it there, and we'll pick them up. If you're not sure about it yet, out in the foyer, we have some sheets that give you all sorts of more kind of information on what the program is and what we're asking you to do. And pray about this. And come back in the next couple weeks and fill out one of these things. We'll have these available every week this month. So that you can get involved in a microgroup, because we need it. We need mentors. We need to mentor others. We need to help each other to live out our relationship with Christ, starting with love and acceptance and moving to obedience. We're going to do that together this year. Let's pray together.